Welcome to the Holding Time podcast. Here we discuss breastfeeding in all its complexity, the ups and downs, the challenges and the triumphs. Whether you are expectant, a new mother, or simply interested, I hope you'll appreciate the incredible warrior women featured in this series. In this mini-series, we go back to feature some mothers who helped to shape the Holding Time project in Coventry. These interviews took place over Zoom in 2020, quite often under lockdown. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Find out more by visiting holdingtime.org or support us on our Patreon channel, Holding Time.
I'm Lily and I have one boy who is 2.5, 2 3/4.
How was your breastfeeding journey at the beginning? How did it go?
There was no question in my mind that it was something that I wanted to do. And looking back, it feels like I had quite an easy time of it. But I suppose it's easy to think that when you're not in it. But the more I've thought about it over the last kind of couple of weeks, I mean, it was really hard work. And there's a lot of times where you think, I just can't do this. And I remember kind of lying awake at 4 a.m, Googling, will my boobs ever feel normal again? Or when my boobs start hurting. So yeah, I think it's easy to, once you've kind of cracked it, to forget how hard it was.
So when do you think you cracked it? How long did it take?
It's hard to remember. I can remember thinking, if I get to 6 months and I can start weaning onto food, then it'll be okay and it will get easier. I think I probably up until about kind of 4 or 5 months thinking, I just can't wait for this to be over. But enjoying it at the same time. You have your good days and bad. But I think probably realistically, at least 3 months, if not longer.
What were your difficulties at the beginning? Did you experience, you said your breast didn't feel normal. Was it painful or?
Oh yeah, incredibly painful. They were just enormous. I mean, I remember going to get measured and the woman kind of going, oh, go in and pop your bra off. And she came in and she went, oh my God, yeah, they are enormous. Thanks, I needed that today.
Yeah.
Looking back as well, I'm not knowing much about it at the time, but I think I probably had oversupply and a very fast letdown and things that I just wasn't really aware were a thing. Only when you learn more about breastfeeding did I realise that that was probably a problem and was probably quite easy to solve if I'd have known.
How much did you know about breastfeeding beforehand?
Nothing really. I mean, when I was pregnant, I didn't read any books. I just thought it's just going to happen.
And so you thought because it's a natural process that it would be a simple process or yeah. Because we tend to think of the words easy and natural as being the same thing, don't we? But then there's lots of things that are natural that are difficult, like dying is difficult, you know, being born is difficult, but is natural. That's the common misconception, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd gone to some of the like NHS, I can't remember what they're called, like preparing baby classes. And they taught you about kind of different ways to hold the baby, but at no point really did they say it might feel like your nipples are going to fall off or your boobs will become rock hard and it'll be impossible to sleep. Possibly if you'd have known beforehand, maybe it would have made me think, oh, I'd have to do that.
And were you breastfed out of interest?
Yes.
Who would you say gave you support? Was your mum as a breastfeeder, was she helpful or was it your partner or, you know, other people or did you have support?
I would say I didn't have anyone that wasn't supportive. And well, no, I think that's unfair actually. I think I mean, my husband was hugely supportive. I can remember kind of we had a little notepad and he'd write down the time of the last feed and how long it lasted and which boob and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah, in the early days he was hugely supportive and my parents as well, I suppose. And there was never any kind of shame or embarrassment from anyone.
Did you feel any embarrassment when you went out into the public spaces doing it there?
Luckily, not at all. Lucky in a sense that I'm quite confident in that sense that I'm just going to do it, and I don't care what anyone thinks.
Do you have any favourite places in Coventry that you would breastfeed that you think are quite good? Were there any places you discovered as like, oh, this is a good place to breastfeed?
Not that's really spring to mind, but there is one place I felt that I wouldn't breastfeed and didn't, which was a barber's. My husband was having his haircut, and I was waiting with my little boy. He was quite small at the time. And that was the only place that I thought, this isn't my place to breastfeed.
It's a bridge too far.
It's a man's space, and I don't want to make anyone uncomfortable.
But other than that...
I would have breastfed anywhere, definitely.
Do you see much breastfeeding around Coventry? Because I don't live in Coventry, but I am from there originally. So when I've gone back, and I've obviously gone back as a breastfeeder as well, because I've got a daughter who's now 8, but, you know, when I was breastfeeding her, which now sounds like years ago, it's actually just, you know, up to 5 years ago. My mum, you know, for example, who still lives there, probably had never seen anyone breastfeed anyone up to 3. And so she'd be quite embarrassed if I'd be doing that in the precinct, you know.
I can't think really that I've ever seen anyone else. Sure, there are people. I'd never really think, oh, there's someone breastfeeding.
Yeah,
not in Coventry, and certainly not older children.
Yeah, older children, that's true everywhere, to be honest. Even in Brighton, where I live, where breastfeeding is a big thing, and there's loads of like real sort of passionate breastfeeders, you still don't see many women breastfeeding toddlers.
No. And my sister-in-law actually lives in Brighton. She breastfed her little boy. She's very classic Brighton, vegan, breastfeeding. But they got to a point where she was a bit like,
yeah,
I think that needs to stop now.
Drawing a line. Yeah, I think it's the point at which they start pulling your clothes up for you while they're standing next to you. Okay, had enough. Yeah, it's not terribly visible in Coventry, but then the statistics for Coventry are quite good.
I felt that I had really great support. I was on a breastfeeding Facebook group, and I heard a lot of women saying that the support from their local NHS was terrible. But I think the support that I got from the midwives and people in Coventry was amazing. A lot of times where I felt ready to stop, and I was able to like get an appointment with them immediately, and they were just encouraging. They would, you know, check your latch. And amazing, really good.
Did you go to breastfeeding groups in Coventry, or did you just have a one-to-one appointment with the community team?
I remember having some one-to-one appointments, some over the phone, and definitely at least one in person. Breastfeeding groups, I can't remember. I think it may have been something I looked into. I'm not entirely sure.
What about baby groups?
No, not really. And I don't really know why. But actually, I think there was a breastfeeding group in IKEA when IKEA was still here that I think I may have went to once.
I was just going to say IKEA. I know it's closed now, but IKEA are actually huge breastfeeding proponents. You know, At one point I thought of situating the project in IKEA for that reason, because they seem like really pro breastfeeding. Well, they come from Northern European countries that are really pro breastfeeding, so it's a cultural thing. There don't seem to be a lot of groups in Coventry, but there does seem to be amazing support from the hospital. I've spoken to at least 3, maybe 4 women who were brought back into hospital when they struggled with breastfeeding. And that's something categorically does not happen in Brighton. I don't know if it's common elsewhere, but that's the first time I've ever heard of it, really, of women being brought back to hospital with feeding problems. Like, that seems like I'd really like to speak to someone at the hospital and say, is this a unique policy? Because I'm hearing about it quite a lot. It seems to have helped a lot of women through a tough patch. So when you were having problems, did you call the midwifery team or did you call the community team? I'm only just nosy, basically.
That's fine. So we have an infant feeding line.
Yeah.
Which was just like a kind of direct line to a mobile number that you kind of knew that someone would pick up.
Yeah.
So, yeah, not so much the maternity.
Yeah, I know that infant feeding group and they're partners in this project, and they have been just completely on board, you know, from the start. It seems like they have a WhatsApp group and new mothers can be part of that. It does seem like there's good NHS support in Coventry. Whereas the health visitors are paid for by the local council, and so it's a different pot of money that, pays for those services. They're a little bit different. What about the library? Did you find that to be a welcoming environment, or?
Coventry Library is not somewhere that I would.
Isn't it? Because in Brighton, that's the big breastfeeding hangout.
Coventry Library is not particularly welcoming.
Oh.
Kind of full stop. I mean, it's a bit of a kind of, it attracts, so I think they kind of made a thing where they were quite keen to kind of host breastfeeding mothers and stuff. But they recently installed a special blue light system in the toilet so that people couldn't kind of inject drugs, which is a good thing. I don't know, possibly, I don't know, but it didn't scream, come and breastfeed here with your small child.
So in terms of advice that you might give to someone just starting out like you, knows nothing about breastfeeding, thinks that maybe they might want to try it, what advice would you give? Do you have any advice for new mums?
I would say know what to expect and do your reading.
Unlike you.
Have a good one. Yeah, unlike me, absolutely. Be fully prepared to go and buy some bras. I had to send my mum out, go and buy me biggest bras you can find on about day 3 or 4, I think. Nipple cream and persevere. Don't quit on a bad day was some of the best advice I got. And know that it will all of a sudden become really easy. One day you'll wake up and it's the easiest thing in the world.
So you were aiming for 6 months. Is that when you stopped, or did you carry on?
No, I'm still feeding now.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So you never planned to feed that long?
I didn't plan to stop at 6 months. And I'm kind of quite passionate that 6 months isn't this kind of arbitrary cutoff point where it stops being good for them. I'm kind of really pro extended breastfeeding or natural term breastfeeding. But when it was the early days, the kind of date in my mind was that if I can get to the point where he's on solid, it's going to get easier, hopefully.
And did it get easier when he was on solids?
No. He showed, up until he was probably about 15 months, he showed almost no interest in food, and he was all about the boob. And I just thought, I'm just going to be keeping this boy alive with breast milk until he's 30. Yeah, I just thought, I don't know how much longer I can do this. And then all of a sudden he decided that he was really interested in food, and pressure was off me a lot. And I thought, I can just carry on doing this.
Because is it less frequent now that he's eating solid food?
Yeah, so we've got it down to kind of once in the morning. I mean, he asks for it all day long, but he's quite happy now for me to say no.
And how old is he? 2.5?
Yeah, 2.5, coming up to 3.
Yeah. Well, I always think about Dr. Sears. I was reading about, I think he called it long-term breastfeeding, but really, like you say, it's full-term breastfeeding is where the child kind of weans themselves. And he said, do you know Dr. Sears? He's a really great paediatrician, he's based in California. His whole family. I
may have heard of.
Yeah, he's got 8 kids and loads of them are paediatricians. It's like this whole paediatrician family, like mafia. And there is very much attachment style parenting. And he says there's very little research done into the benefits to the children who are breastfed full term. There's almost no research. And if you don't ask those questions, you don't find the answers. But mothers that I speak to, and I do speak to a lot of breastfeeding mothers, none of them ever want to breastfeed a day longer than they have to, really. I mean, there might be some oh, that was nice, but there's no oh, let's keep going a bit longer, Everybody wants to stop.
Yeah.
Everybody, even the most impassioned breastfeeding mothers, I'd say, I don't know if I even have ever met one exception to this. They all want to stop, but they all do it because they can tell that it's benefiting their child. But what we don't know is what's the benefit, I mean, definitely there's nutritional benefit, but is there more than that?
Mm-hmm.
Don't know. Because you can't really ever say, well, do an A/B test and say that child wasn't breastfed and that was, because they're both so different. You know, for example, I do know of one mother who's still breastfeeding a boy who's 6, and that's really, really rare. But then that boy is special needs. So you sort of wonder, how would he be if he hadn't been breastfed?
Yeah.
You know? So you can never know, but well done for breastfeeding as long as you have. It's brilliant.
No, you're absolutely right there. And I used to hear a lot of, it's more about you now.
Oh, that is so.
And it's not about me. I don't want to do this. I want my boobs back.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I've really tried to focus on. I mean, part of this work is I make these portraits and they're very beautiful because they're shot in a certain way, they're lit in a certain way. And the idea is to make a beautiful portrait of breastfeeding, because I think we're missing that in our culture. And it's something that I feel is massively undervalued, that I want to give value to. And the way to do that is to honour it, you know, in this beautiful portrait. But the interviews are very much about looking at the other side and giving those women in the portraits a voice, so they can say, well, look, it wasn't always this nice, or maybe it's not even that nice right now. So it's important to present both sides of the debate, if you like. But to say that breastfeeding a toddler is for the mother's benefit, I think is so categorically wrong that it's actually really offensive.
Yeah, no, I agree completely.
And that is simply based on the fact that there is so little research, and the fact there's so little research is based on us living in really quite an ignorant culture in terms of breastfeeding. And you could probably call it misogynistic, you know, because...
Oh, no, I agree with you. I could go on all day.
Yeah. Those things people say sometimes because they're very ignorant, and they sort of reveal that ignorance in saying them. Mm-hmm. And that ignorance is everywhere, I suppose. But, yeah, you know yourself.
Such a thorny topic as well. I mean, even I have a friend who had a baby 3 months before me. And she was also very adamant that she was going to breastfeed. And for whatever reason, it just didn't work out for her. And it became a bit of an awkwardness between us that neither of us ever acknowledged or spoke about, but it was there.
It's a real shame. Yeah, women are polarised. Those who can breastfeed are pitched against those who can't. And I come across that a lot with this work because, you know, I've had to make a case for putting portraits of breastfeeding mothers in hospitals because people have said you're shaming women who can't breastfeed and so on. And really with that mentality, nothing's ever going to change, you know. But there does need to be an acknowledgement of how difficult breastfeeding can be. The other thing that's starting to come to light, or the research is being done now, is about the connection between not being able to breastfeed and grief, and the type of grief that women might experience as a result of losing that relationship, and the hormonal changes and how that can lead to postnatal depression. You know, there's a very definite link there. I mean, I'm actually someone who couldn't breastfeed and then did breastfeed. So I get it from both sides. I mean, I've been both people. I've been the one who couldn't breastfeed, who felt that grief and that jealousy really towards mothers around me that could. And then my daughter, she was tongue-tied, and at 4 months she did start to breastfeed because I'd been expressing, so I still had milk. And so I went from being a bottle feeder to a breastfeeder, and that's an unusual journey. And I ended up breastfeeding longer than those mothers that I had been envious of. And I was actually dismayed to see them stop, because for me it had been such a challenge to get it going. I thought, why on earth would you stop if you don't have to, you know? But it's fraught, really. The whole subject is quite fraught. We need just much more conversation. It needs to be much more open and more informed, you know?
I mean, the amount of kind of misinformation that I've seen other women spout as gospel, it's sad.
Yeah, well, we are living in a culture, as I say, that's very ignorant, and that's not going to change until we have lots of, it's going to be women, but it's also their partners and their mothers and their sisters and so on. These groups that start to dispel the myths in their own communities. It's a kind of seeding process. It's a bit like reseeding the Amazon. It's like it's all been cut down. It's all gone. And all has to be repopulated, and that means knowledge and information and proper understanding on loads of different levels of how breastfeeding is instrumental in child development. It's a tool, it's the most useful tool that we have. And yet in most of these baby manuals, it's the demon, it's the cause of all the problems, it's the thing that you should take away because that's the reason, God, I could go on about it for time. I've been doing this
what I hear is how will dad bond with baby if you can't give baby a bond? And it's like you say, that's misogyny in action. It's not about dad.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? I mean, it's very reductive of the mother's role.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it's playing completely into the hands of all the formula companies who are literally rubbing their hands in glee.
Yeah,
but £29.5 billion later, I mean, it's big industry and leads to all sorts of, I think, huge problems. But anyway, here we are, we're doing what we can. And the point of this really with Coventry City of Culture is to kind of use City of Culture as an opportunity to raise the profile of breastfeeding in Coventry, but also nationally, because City of Culture sort of gives us a platform to talk about health. I mean, it's supposed to be one of their remits is health, mental health, physical health, and so on. So the idea at this stage is just to recruit a kind of cohort of mothers who can participate in these various stages of this project. And the idea of the project is that through multiple channels, we influence the community. So through the portraits, that's the first thing that I want mothers who've just given birth to see. So those portraits will go in the labour ward of Walsgrave, and then there'll be links from the portrait. So each mother that is photographed, you'll be able to go on a QR code and listen to their individual story.
Thanks for listening, and thanks to everyone involved, our funders, the infant feeding team and University Hospital Coventry and Warwick for their support, along with all the amazing mothers and partners who helped to make this project happen. You can learn more about the project by visiting holdingtime.org and support us on our Patreon channel. There's a link in the description. Thanks for listening, and be sure to like, follow or subscribe so you don't miss any of our content.